In 1926, Edgar Cayce received a request for a medical reading from an ex-coal miner in West Virginia. 4 years previously, the 24-year-old man had been hurt in a car wreck and was paralyzed from the neck down. On August 31st of that year, Cayce gave the reading, which began by insisting that a reading focusing on past lives would be more appropriate. Cayce then proceeded to give some suggestions for physical therapy to prepare the body for surgery. However, the prognosis was grim. At the close of the reading, Cayce reiterated his suggestion for a review of the past lives of the entity. In an undertone that could hardly be heard, Cayce whispered, "See, this is Nero." The Nero indicated by Cayce was the adopted heir of his great-uncle, the Roman Emperor Claudius. Nero became ruler of Rome with the death of Claudius in 54 AD and reigned until his own death in 68 AD. He committed suicide when a military coup drove him from the throne. Nero's reign is typically associated with extravagance and cruelty. He is credited with the executions of his mother and adopted brother. Some accounts have him setting fire to Rome and playing a harp while watching it burn. Whether it was an act of arson on his account has been debated. It is a fact that he was frustrated in his attempts to obtain the targeted area of Rome for his new palace. It is also a fact that the fire made room for his palace and created ill will amongst the populace who blamed him for the disaster. The other notorious activity associated with Nero's reign was the persecution of the early Christians, who were sacrificed in the arena. Some historians have connected the fire with the persecutions, suggesting that Nero's vengeance against the followers of Jesus was an attempt to focus blame away from himself and onto the new religious cult. Scapegoating. The Cayce readings affirm the view that the fire was caused by Nero. A 33-year-old contractor received a life reading from Cayce in 1934 that discussed the aftermath of the fire that destroyed a large portion of Rome. The reading stated that the contractor had been a man named Philo during the period of the rebuilding after the destructions by the tyrant, as called, or emperor, by burning. Philo aided and assisted the common people who suffered from the disaster, explaining to them how those in authority used their political and commercial power for personal gain, while the poor were oppressed. Philo gained through this experience and carried over into his present life an interest in Roman history and architecture, and a concern for the role of common people in the affairs of a nation. Cayce gave many other readings for individuals associated with Nero and his reign. One of the common karmic patterns follows the example of Nero himself, in which cruelty in a past life results in a future life of physical deformity and suffering. For example, a close companion of Nero named Emerson was cited by Cayce as the past life of a 53-year-old housewife who suffered from a serious back deformity and numerous other injuries since childhood. Her reading, given in 1944, began with a curious observation that some very interesting characters have been born near Bellefontaine. This peculiar side note echoes the information volunteered many years earlier concerning Caesar being born in Bellefontaine, as we have discussed in a previous section. Cayce went on to explain that during her Roman experience, she was closely associated with the persecutor of the early Christians who fiddled while Rome burned. To quote her reading, "That's the reason this entity in body has been disfigured by structural conditions." Cayce stated that she had scoffed at those being persecuted to gain favor and material pleasure from Nero and his crowd. Cayce then declared that in terms of soul development, this entity had advanced from such a low degree in its Roman experience and subsequent lives that she may not require further incarnations in the earth realm. Not that she was perfect, but simply that if she made the most of her present earthly incarnation, she might be ready to move on to other realms for her soul's education. Interestingly, this woman recalls that as a youngster, she was so lacking in musical talent that her instructor dismissed the child as a disgrace to her teaching. But she was so fond of a piece of music called Ben-Hur Chariot Race, she played it over and over by the hour. Even though doctors said that her physical deformity was incurable and would eventually cause her death, and she did nearly die and suffered greatly during her early years, over time she was gradually healed, to the extent that a report by her provided when she was 58 states that she was the picture of health. Apparently, her physical healing reflected development in the mental and spiritual aspects of life as well. Her life was exemplary in service to others and dedication to her ideals. Another example of karma from the Nero period was discussed in a reading for a 48-year-old housewife who was informed that she had been among the royalty of ancient Rome and was closely associated with Nero and those in authority at that time. During the persecutions when the Christians were forced to fight beasts in the arena, she laughed at those victims who were mangled and crippled or slaughtered outright. Her reading began with the observation, "For as one soweth, so one reaps." In her present incarnation, this woman had been afflicted with polio, suffering greatly, unable to walk, and depended upon the kind and patient assistance of her family for even the simple activities of daily life. Her reading noted that she was blessed to be surrounded by those whom she had laughed at in the arenas in Rome. She was encouraged not to condemn herself or others, but to use the experience to draw closer to the divine. A third case associated with the Nero period that involved physical karma and group incarnation was documented in a series of readings for a teenager who was brought to the Casey Hospital in 1930 suffering from osteochondritis, inflammation of the hip. She received several physical readings to address this painful and crippling disorder before getting a life reading that discussed the karmic patterns involved. In all, she received 45 readings over an 8-year period and felt that she had benefited greatly from the information provided in her readings. She was told that she had once lived among the ruling class in Rome during the latter portion of Nero's reign. In the name Partheniaceae and in the household of Parthesius, she was secretly aware of and sympathetic to the plight of the Christians who were sometimes sheltered in her home. As she watched the slaughter of the Christians in the arena, she laughed at the anguish of the persecuted to maintain social status with her Roman upper-class friends. In her heart, she agonized over the suffering of the Christians and admired the strength of their convictions. In her present life, she carried over an inexpressible feeling of fear of activities, such as outdoor sports, that could lead to the rending of limbs or shedding of blood. With regard to group incarnation, she was informed that one of the girls whom she had laughed at in Rome was now her brother's wife. She was told to be careful not to laugh at others' sincerity and not to hold grudges, but rather to manifest the fruits of the Spirit and draw close to creative forces. She was also associated with her present father during her past life in Rome. He had been a Roman bureaucrat named Palomo who traveled the provinces, keeping surveillance and sending reports back to Rome. Like his daughter in her past life, he felt sympathy for the Christians but kept his beliefs secret to avoid scorn from his superiors in Rome. His readings noted that there were many among his family and associates who were working out their individual and group Roman karma together.